This is the first in the series of the bone tour, if we want to call it that. We're going to start with the bones of the cranium and the face, which are actually two different sets of bones. We have the cranial bones, which are flat bones, and the facial bones, which are irregular bones. We can do it that way. So let's just start naming some of these bones as we go around. Let's start on the upper right and work our way in a clockwise motion. And start with that first bone. I know you can name that. Yes, I know you put frontal because I told you to. Now the next one, right below it, is pointing to that little spot right, right on your forehead, right there above your nose. That's right, where you want to press your finger when someone does not get what you're saying to them. The glabella. What fun. Then, of course, we have the bones of the nose, which on my horse skull or hog skull are breaking out a little bit. Those are the nasal bones. The teeny tiny little, less than mustard, well, a good mustard color on that photograph. That's the lacrimal. It has the lacrimal duct in it. And the word lacrimose means sad, and that can help you remember the tear duct in it. The next one is talking about all of that area of purple bone known as the maxilla. I should put an I in that. And then the edge where that maxilla meets the teeth, those are the alveolar border of the maxilla. We have to put that because there's another alveolar border on the mandible. The little hole below the eye is the infraorbital foramen. And then the bone I had to mold in because, you know, it got lost, is the zygomatic. Now we can see a peek of some of the other bones in there. We can see a bit of the sphenoid bone right in there. We cannot see at all the ethmoid bone, which is right in there. We can't see it from that view. We can see a little bit of the vomer, which I had to make, and the inferior nasal concha, which are on the walls, the lateral walls of the nose cavity, if you want to think of it that way. We can see a touch of the temporal bone in there. And maybe, just maybe, a little bit of light green back there of the parietal bone. But we'll see that on the next view. Look, told you. So we do have some sutures in here we need to know as well. And I've labeled the sutures with the orange arrows and the bones with the green arrows. So let's start with the bones, and we're going to start upper right. And the first bone of choice up there in that green bone with the green arrow is the parietal bone. I knew you knew it, which you're going to call parietal, you bad children. Then our next one is the occipital bone in blue. And then our next bone, it's got two green arrows to it, but we're looking at this one. That is called the temporal bone. And then the other one to the red bone is the sphenoid. And that's a good view of that sphenoid. I still don't have a good view of that ethmoid in there for you. Be sure and look at that in class. Now let's look at the sutures associated with those. The first suture at the top, connecting the frontal bone to the parietal bone, is called the coronal suture. The next one, back here, connects the parietal bones to the occipital bone, and that is known as the lambdoid suture. Connecting the occipital bone to the mastoid process, if we want to think of it that way instead of the temporal, is the occipito mastoid. And I had to hyphenate that. It shouldn't be. It's all one word. Suture. Oh, I left off one way up here at the top. Between this one right here, between the parietal bones and the temporal bones is the squamosal or squamous suture. And that's pretty much got us on that. Then, of course, we should label our mastoid process. The styloid process on that particular skull broke off, so I couldn't label it for you from that view. And I should have turned it around. But, you know, that other zygomatic bone didn't look as pretty, so I didn't do it. And those are the parts of the good view of the side view of the skull. You can see lots of different things there. Here's the skull from a top view, above the skull looking down, because you don't have a picture of that in your lab manual. Let's label some of these parts. We have the gold bone on the front, the frontal bone. We have the green bone called the parietal bone. We have the suture in between the two, known as the coronal suture. Then we have this sagittal suture between the two parietal bones, and that's the one you can never see in our lab manual. Then down at the bottom, the blue bone is the occipital bone. Let me change colors on that pen. And the suture between the occipital and the parietal is the lambdoid suture. That's good. We'll move on. Now this is your favorite view. Yes, I know. The first thing I have to tell you is this was on the real skull up on the front of the classroom on my desk. And the palatine bone on that skull is completely gone. You cracked out. I do have remnants of it left on either side. So I'm going to start with that palatine bone. The reason I chose this skull for the photograph is because it does show the foramen so much better. The foramina that you have to know. So let's start with that first foramen up at the front. Well, it's actually a fossa called the incisive fossa, which I just misspelled 18 ways. Let me try it again. Maybe I had it right. It still looks incisive. It looks wrong, but maybe it's right. Fossa. Then we have the palate part of the maxilla. In between the two areas of the maxilla is that median palatine suture. No, I got that wrong. That's a different suture. The median palatine suture I've got represented by my blue line between the maxilla and the palatine bone. Okay, I stopped and looked that up because it was bothering me. I was right the first time. I'm like you guys. I should trust my first impressions. The median palatine suture is where the two bones of the maxilla fuse together, and when they don't fuse, that's when you get the cleft palate. So that is the median palatine suture there. Whew, had to question myself. I do it all the time. So now you know that the hard palate is composed of two bones coming together where that blue line is. The anterior part is the maxilla. The posterior part is the palatine bone. And then we have the soft palate tissue hanging off of that a little bit further. Great. Now let's move on. We can do some easy stuff here. Let me move this little recording box over to the other side. Starting at the bottom on the left side, that great big hole in that occipital bone. Yes, I know you know that that is the foramen magnum. We'll do these easy things before we do those hard little foramina over there. Then we have these bumps on the anterior side of that foramen magnum, which are going to meet with the first cervical vertebra. These are called the occipital condyles. The great big bump, indicated by the next arrow up, is the mastoid process. And then there's a little sharp spine sticking up in front of that, and one of these is actually still on this bone. Because it's real, it broke, on the other side. So this is called the styloid process. We'll have many of those throughout the skeleton. So we do have to say the styloid process of the temporal bone. Then we have this depression where the mandible meets the skull. That's called the mandibular fossa. Mandibular fossa. That's a really good view of the zygomatic arch right there. Pretty. Now look at the 3 green arrows. You'll notice that the holes that they lead to, if you connected the dots, would make a kind of a triangle, kind of like that. The one innermost, or the top of the 3 green arrows, is called the foramen lacerum. Because it has jagged edges. The next one is oval in shape, so it's called the foramen ovale. And then we have one that's a pinhole, like a spine went through it, so it's called the foramen spinosum. Quite nice. Then we have the 2 in yellow. Let's start at the bottom. This is a very large hole, and it has a very large vein going through it. This is the jugular foramen. And then right above it is where the very large artery goes through, and the area is called the carotid canal. I misspelled that. C-A-R-O-T-I-D. Pardon me. Okay. Those look good. You can come back and study that picture again. Now let's look at the inside of this skull. This is taking the skull cap off, the parietal bones, so we can look inside. And we have some areas in here we need to talk about. Here's probably our best view of that ethmoid bone is right here. And it has several parts in it that you are supposed to know. On the other view, you couldn't really see them. You have the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, which makes part of the nasal septum. We couldn't see that. All we could see was the vomer. But from this view, we can see actually 3 areas of this ethmoid bone. We have a little crest sticking up in the center called the crista galli. Except there's no H in that word. Let me fix that. It's just crista galli. Sorry about that. Just like you guys. Okay, and then we have the plate, which is gone on this picture because it's real bone. It's very fragile, very easy to crack through. And that little plate is called the cribriform plate. In it are teeny, teeny, tiny little holes, and you can see some remnants of those holes there. Those are called olfactory foramina. Yay! Then we have a pair of holes. If you can see the bat, I can see the bat. I'm going to outline the bat here for a minute. Here's the bat. You can see the bat. It's Halloween. You can see the bat. Okay, so the first thing pointing in up there, that top green arrow, that is the optic canal coming through from the eye socket. We are looking at the bat now in the blue, which is the sphenoid bone. And we have a couple of depressions in there for us. We have this big depression in here, which is where the pituitary gland sits, called the sella turcica. And then we have a little round hole called the foramen rotundum. We have the jugular foramen down here. And then we have the internal auditory meatus from that view. I forgot to label that on another view. Oh well. And I believe that's got it as far as that goes. Oh, we'll just do another video on that mandible by itself.